Every Tuesday morning for 9 straight years, a white catering van from Hartwell Foods pulled up to the same narrow laneway behind a small repair shop in Hamilton, Ontario and unloaded another broken piece of commercial kitchen equipment. No phone call ahead, no explanation attached. Just a handwritten work order tucked under a bungee cord, a serial number, and a line that read "Return by Friday." The van never waited, the driver never came inside. A man who received those deliveries, alone, every single time, never once complained. His name was Daniel Okafor. He was 41 years old with the kind of hands that told you more about his life than he ever would himself. Thick calluses across the palms, a burn scar on the inside of his right wrist from a commercial oven element, back when he was 23 and still learning. Fingernails that never quite came fully clean no matter how long he scrubbed. He was broad through the shoulders, with close-cropped hair that had gone silver at the temples earlier than most men his age, and a way of going quiet when he was thinking that some people mistook for coldness. It wasn't coldness, it was concentration. Daniel Okafor did not waste attention. His shop, D&K Appliance Services, sat on a dead-end service road off Barton Street East, sandwiched between a sheet metal supplier and a parking lot that had been under renovation for 6 years. A sign above the door was hand-painted. The front window had a crack that he'd sealed with clear epoxy because replacing it wasn't in the budget that month, and then wasn't in the budget the next month either. Inside, the space was organized with a precision that surprised people who wandered in expecting chaos. Tools sorted by function, parts cataloged in labeled bins, a whiteboard on the wall tracking every open job with estimated completion times, clean concrete floor, a small desk near the back with a laptop, a gooseneck lamp, and, depending on the time of day, a half-finished drawing of a horse or a dinosaur left there by his daughter. Lily was 10 years old. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness and an absolute refusal to eat anything orange, which had made the vegetable situation in their household genuinely complicated for years. Her mother, Kezia, had died when Lily was 4, an aneurysm, a kind of thing that gives no warning and allows no argument. Daniel had been at the shop when it happened. He'd driven home to find the neighbor standing at the door with Lily on her hip, and there was something about the neighbor's face, the way she couldn't quite meet his eyes, that he understood before she said a word. He didn't talk about that period much. What he would say to the handful of people he trusted enough to say anything to at all, was that there were about 8 months after Kezia died when he genuinely didn't know how he was going to keep going. Not in a dramatic way, just in the quiet, practical sense of not knowing how one person could do everything that 2 people had barely managed together. The mortgage, the shop lease, the daycare pickup, the grocery runs, the forms from the school board, nights when Lily had bad dreams and needed someone to sit with her until she fell back asleep, and then Daniel would sit there in the dark after she drifted off, too exhausted to move, too wired to sleep himself. He kept going the way most people keep going, one day at a time, which sounds simple until you're in it, and then it sounds like the hardest possible instruction anyone has ever given you. The Hartwell Foods contract had started in the 3rd year after Kezia died. At the time, Daniel had been scraping together commercial repair work wherever he could find it. Restaurant equipment, institutional kitchen appliances, catering company gear. He was good at it in the specific way that is hard to explain to people who haven't seen it. He understood mechanical systems, the way a musician understands sound, not just what the manual told him, but what the thing was actually doing, what it was trying to tell him when it misbehaved. He could listen to a commercial dishwasher running and identify the problem before he opened the casing. He once repaired a blast chiller that 3 other technicians had declared unserviceable, and it ran for another 6 years after that. Hartwell Foods found him the way most of his commercial clients found him, through a referral from someone who'd been burned by faster, flashier options. They were a mid-sized food production and catering company headquartered in Mississauga, with distribution contracts that stretched across southern Ontario and into Quebec. Their equipment budget was managed by a procurement department that operated on the logic that the cheapest option was the right option until it demonstrably wasn't, at which point they needed the problem to disappear quietly and quickly. Daniel's shop became the place problems disappeared. They sent him things that shouldn't have been salvageable: conveyor ovens with warped heating elements, blast freezers with corroded compressor lines, proofing cabinets that had been dropped during a delivery and were structurally compromised in ways the manufacturer's warranty explicitly did not cover. He fixed them, not always cheaply, and not always on the timeline the work order demanded, but he fixed them, and they stayed fixed, and nobody at Hartwell Foods ever had to think about it again. That was the arrangement. That was all it was. The woman whose company sent him those machines was named Renata Johansson. She was 44, the chief operating officer of Hartwell Foods, and she had been with the company for 11 years, the last 4 of which she had spent systematically restructuring its supplier and service networks around 3 principles: cost reduction, operational speed, and what she called vendor consolidation, which meant shrinking the list of external contractors to a manageable number and extracting maximum value from each relationship. Renata was not a cruel person. That distinction matters. She was a focused one. She had grown up in Thunder Bay, the daughter of a Finnish-Canadian carpenter and a mother who kept the books for 3 different small businesses simultaneously, and she had absorbed from both of them a deep and abiding respect for efficiency and a corresponding impatience with waste. She had an MBA from Queen's, a reputation for delivering results under pressure, and a corner office with a window that looked out over the 401. She was genuinely good at her job. Hartwell Foods she'd inherited was hemorrhaging money on redundant supplier contracts. The Hartwell Foods she built was leaner, faster, and consistently profitable. But lean systems have a particular vulnerability that efficient people sometimes miss. When you strip away redundancy, you also strip away resilience. When you optimize for speed, you sometimes optimize away the people who are slow and careful and irreplaceable. She had never met Daniel Okafor. 9 years of weekly deliveries, not once. He was a vendor code in a procurement system. He was a line item on a maintenance budget. He was a turnaround time that was consistently better than any alternative option they'd tested, though Renata had never personally examined why. Daniel knew who she was. He'd looked her up once, early in the contract, the way you'd look up anyone your livelihood depended on. He'd read a profile of her in a trade publication, Modernizing the Supply Chain. How Renata Johansson is rebuilding Hartwell Foods from the inside out. He'd looked at her photo for a moment, noted the confident expression and the quality of the suit, and gone back to the compressor rebuild sitting on his workbench. He didn't hold any particular resentment about the impersonality of the arrangement. He understood it. Large companies didn't maintain personal relationships with every external contractor. That would be operationally impossible. Work orders were professional. The payments arrived on time, which was more than he could say for some clients. The equipment they sent was often in appalling condition, but that was job security as much as anything else. What he did privately was keep records, not for any strategic reason. Partly from professional habit, he documented every job thoroughly, photographed the before and after, logged the fault codes and his diagnostic process. Over time, the Hartwell file had grown into something more than routine documentation. 9 years of weekly deliveries, hundreds of pieces of equipment. He'd started cross-referencing the failure patterns and found things that should have been useful to Hartwell's engineering team if anyone there had been paying attention. Recurring faults in a particular model of commercial mixer that suggested a design flaw in the drive assembly. A pattern of premature compressor failure in their refrigeration units that pointed to an installation issue, not a manufacturing defect. Things that, if addressed upstream, would have saved them significant money and significantly reduced the volume of emergency repairs. He'd flagged it once, in a formal note attached to a work order, early in year 4 of the contract. The note came back with a stamp that said received and nothing else. He didn't flag it again. He just kept fixing what arrived at his door. Lily had grown up around those machines. As a toddler she'd sat in a playpen in the corner of the shop while Daniel worked. As she got older she'd graduated to the desk with the gooseneck lamp and the drawings. She understood, with the matter-of-fact clarity of a child who has grown up in a working environment, that the machines her dad fixed kept the lights on and the fridge stocked and the activities paid for. She didn't romanticize it. Naughty. She also didn't take it for granted, which Daniel thought said something good about her character. On Tuesday mornings, when the white van arrived, she'd sometimes look up from whatever she was doing and say, "Hartwell?" And Daniel would say, "Yeah," and she'd say, "What they break this time?" And he'd say something like, "We'll see," and that would be the end of the conversation. It was a ritual, like a lot of small things in their life together, unremarkable and steady. And then, in the 43rd month of what would later be described in the financial press as Hartwell Foods' worst operational crisis in its 30-year history, the white van didn't come. Before the story continues, if you've ever felt like the most reliable person in the room and the least noticed, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Share this with someone who deserves to hear it today. Subscribe to Integrity Tales for more stories about the people who hold things together when no one's looking. It started, as these things often do, not with a single catastrophic failure, but with a cluster of smaller ones arriving too close together to manage. A major retail contract cancelled following a food safety audit that found temperature control inconsistencies in 3 of Hartwell's distribution facilities. 2 key production managers resigned within a month of each other, taking institutional knowledge that turned out to be less documented than anyone had realized. A piece of litigation with a former distribution partner that had been quietly managed for 2 years suddenly accelerated and became public. Then, the operational wound that proved hardest to close, a critical failure in the automated production line at the Mississauga facility that knocked their primary packaging capacity offline for 6 weeks during the highest volume quarter of the year. Ada had been in the building for 32 hours straight when her director of facilities management placed a manila folder on the desk in front of her and said quietly, "You should look at this." The folder contained an internal audit that had been commissioned 3 months earlier, before the crisis, as part of a routine vendor performance review. It was supposed to be a cost reduction exercise, identify contractors who could be consolidated or replaced. Instead, it had turned up something the auditor described with visible discomfort as a significant dependency that isn't reflected anywhere in our risk assessment documentation. Renata read the summary twice. One external contractor, operating from a single bay repair shop in Hamilton, had handled 43% of their emergency equipment repairs over the past 9 years. His turnaround time averaged 38% faster than any alternative service provider they'd used. His return for repair rate, meaning the percentage of fixed equipment that came back broken again within 6 months, was 4%. The industry average was 22%. In one documented case, equipment he had repaired had outlasted its manufacturer projected lifespan by 7 years. The contractor's name was Daniel Okafor. There was a note in the file. It had been submitted in year 4 of the contract and marked received and apparently never read by anyone with decision-making authority. It contained a detailed analysis of recurring failure patterns in Hartwell's equipment fleet and specific recommendations for upstream interventions that would have, the auditor's estimate, not the contractor's, saved the company somewhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million over the subsequent 5 years. Renata sat with that number for a long moment. Then she asked for his contact information and said she'd make the call herself. She drove to Hamilton on a Thursday. No communications team, no assistant. She parked outside D&K Appliance Services and sat in the car for a moment looking at the cracked front window and the hand-painted sign and the parking lot next door that had been under renovation for, it appeared, quite some time. Then she got out and went inside. Daniel was at the workbench, mid-reassembly on a commercial steam kettle. He looked up when she came in. He recognized her immediately. The face from the trade publication photo, though she looked more tired now, in the specific way that a certain kind of professional exhaustion produces that no amount of expensive clothing can fully conceal. There was a pause. Lily was at the desk, doing homework. She looked up too, took in the situation with the quick social calibration of a child who'd spent her whole life reading rooms, and went back to her work. "Mr. Okafor," Renata said. "Monsieur Hansen," Daniel said. She hadn't expected him to know her name. The small surprise crossed her face, and she didn't quite manage to conceal it. He didn't comment on it. "I'd like to talk," she said. "If you have a few minutes." "I have a steam kettle that needs to be back in service by Monday," he said. "I can talk while I work if that's all right with you." She said it was. She told him the truth. Not the polished version, not the version she would have given to the board or to a journalist, the actual situation, with the actual numbers. The production line, the contracts, the litigation. The specific technical failure in their packaging equipment that their internal team had been unable to resolve in 3 weeks of trying, and that was now projected to cost them, conservatively, $4 million if it ran another 4 weeks. Daniel listened without interrupting. His hands kept moving, torquing a fitting here, checking a seal there, with the unhurried steadiness of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Renata had spent 11 years in operational leadership, and she had rarely seen anyone work the way Daniel Okafor worked. There was no performance in it, no consciousness of being observed. He was simply a person doing a job to the absolute limit of his ability because that was apparently the only way he knew how to do it. She waited for him to say something pointed about 9 years of Tuesday deliveries, about the note in year 4, about the phone call she'd never made. She would have deserved it. She had thought, driving down the QEW, about what she would say if he wanted to have that conversation, and she hadn't found a satisfying answer. He didn't say any of it. He asked her to describe the failure in the packaging line, what error codes were displaying, what the maintenance team had already checked, whether the failure was consistent or intermittent. She pulled out her phone and showed him the technical documentation her facilities team had compiled. He looked at it for maybe 90 seconds. It's a calibration cascade, he said. The primary sensor is fine. The secondary sensor is reading 3 degrees off because the mounting bracket has a hairline stress fracture, probably from a vibration issue that's been present for a while. The system keeps defaulting to fault mode because it's receiving contradictory data and it can't resolve the conflict. Your team has been trying to fix the sensors. The problem is the bracket. Renata stared at him. How long would it take you to confirm that? She asked. If I'm on site, 2 hours to confirm, another 6 to repair if you have the part, or I can source it by tomorrow morning. She booked him for the following day. It was exactly what he'd said. 2 hours. A hairline fracture in the mounting bracket, invisible to visual inspection, detectable by the specific way the sensor readings diverged under load. He explained it to Hartwell's engineering team without condescension, walked them through the diagnostic logic, answered every question. The packaging line was running again by 4 in the afternoon. That was the beginning of a different kind of conversation. Over the following weeks, Daniel worked with Hartwell's facilities and engineering teams in a way that he had never been invited to work before, as an equal, not a vendor. He walked through all 3 production facilities. He reviewed maintenance records. He identified 6 additional failure risks before they became failures. He found the installation error that had been causing premature compressor failure for years, a grounding issue that had been creating micro-voltage spikes in the refrigeration units, slowly degrading the compressors from the inside out. He found the mixer drive assembly problem he'd flagged in year 4 and showed them, with 9 years of his own documentation, exactly how the failure rate had progressed, and what it would have taken to stop it. Hartwell's engineering team was, to their credit, not defensive about it. They were mostly relieved. Some of them were visibly embarrassed, but they set aside and got to work, which Daniel respected. Renata observed all of it, not just the technical competence, which was extraordinary, but the way he operated in the spaces around the technical work. He was patient with younger technicians who asked questions he'd already answered 3 times. He was direct with people who wasted time, but not unkind. He refused to overstate his certainty. When he didn't know something, he said so, which in Renata's experience was rarer than it should have been at his level, and every day at 3:30 his phone alarm went off, and he would say excuse me and step away to call Lily, just to check in before the end of the school day. She noticed that. She noticed it because it didn't occur to him to hide it or apologize for it. It was simply part of how he structured his life and his work were not in conflict. They were the same thing. The same set of commitments, to the same small universe of people and machines he had decided to care for properly. One evening, staying late at the Mississauga facility to finish a diagnostic report, she found Daniel in the break room with a thermos of coffee and a school schedule spread on the table beside his laptop. He was figuring out how to manage the following week's site visits around Lily's science fair and a parent-teacher conference. He wasn't complaining about it, he was just solving it, the way he solved everything, methodically and without drama. You could have brought this to us years ago, Renata said. She didn't mean it as an accusation, it came out quieter than that. Daniel looked at her for a moment. I brought it to you in year 4, he said. I got a stamp that said received. She didn't have an answer for that. I'm sorry, she said. It was possibly the most unvarnished sentence she'd said in a professional context in 11 years. She had expected it to feel like vulnerability. Instead it felt like accuracy. Daniel nodded, went back to the schedule. Tuesday of next week is the science fair, he said. I can do the Brampton facility Wednesday and Thursday if that works. It worked. Hartwell Foods stabilized over the following quarter, not instantly, not completely, but the operational bleeding slowed and then stopped. 2 of the cancelled contracts were renegotiated. The litigation settled on terms that were, at minimum, not catastrophic. The production line held. Investor confidence, which had been sliding for months, steadied. The board had questions. What had turned it around? What specifically had changed? Adita's answer was simpler than they expected. They had started actually listening to the people who understood how things worked, rather than managing them from a distance through automated purchase orders. She recommended a structural change to how Hartwell engaged with its external service partners, a shift toward genuine technical collaboration rather than transactional outsourcing. The board approved it. Partly because the numbers supported it and partly because the alternative was harder to defend. She offered Daniel a formal consulting role, a senior technical advisor, with a scope that would let him continue running D&K appliance services, because she understood by now that the shop wasn't just a business for him. It was the physical anchor of his life, the place where Lily had grown up and where Keziah's absence had gradually become something he carried rather than something that flattened him. She understood that asking him to give it up entirely would be asking him to give up something she didn't have the right to ask for. He took the role. After reading the contract carefully and adding 3 conditions, he would set his own schedule around his daughter's needs, no exceptions. He would have genuine technical authority, not advisory optics, and the documentation system he'd developed over 9 years, the failure pattern records, the maintenance histories, the diagnostic protocols, would be treated as an intellectual contribution, not a vendor deliverable. Hartwell's legal team initially had concerns about the 3rd condition. Renata overruled them. Tuesday mornings still looked like Tuesdays for a while, then they looked different, not a white van pulling silently into a laneway and leaving without a word, but scheduled site visits with actual conversations before and after, technical briefings where Daniel sat at the table, rather than behind the handwritten work order. Lily, at her desk with the gooseneck lamp, started telling her friends at school that her dad was a consultant for a major food company, which was accurate in the way that children's summaries are often accurate. Technically correct and missing about 90% of the texture. There was one afternoon in late November, when the Mississauga facility had its first clean quarterly inspection in 4 years. No deficiencies, no flagged risks. The facility's manager sent Daniel a text that was just 3 exclamation marks. He showed it to Lily, who was unimpressed because she was 12 and 12-year-olds are professionally unimpressed by things. But later that evening he saw her, when she thought he wasn't looking, tell her best friend on the phone, "My dad fixed their whole company." Not quite, but also not wrong. Renata visited the Hamilton shop once more, months later, not for any work reason. She brought coffee and a box of butter tarts from a bakery near the Hartwell office that she knew were good, because she'd asked around. They sat at Daniel's worktable with a disassembled exhaust fan between them, and talked for an hour about nothing in particular. The mechanics of commercial kitchen ventilation, the specific challenges of raising a kid in a city where everything cost too much, the way that fixing something, actually diagnosing it, not just patching it, but understanding what had gone wrong and correcting it at the source, had a satisfaction to it that was different from almost anything else. She understood that now. She hadn't always. "Can I ask you something?" she said near the end. "Sure," he said. "The note you sent in year 4, the failure pattern analysis, why did you only send it once?" He considered the question with the same deliberateness he brought to everything. "Because it was information that was useful to you," he said. "Whether you used it was your call. My job was to tell you once clearly, and then do my job well enough that the offer stayed open. That's all I can control." She thought about that for a long time afterward. Longer than she thought she would. The white van was decommissioned eventually. The laneway behind D&K Appliance Services became a different kind of place, less anonymous. Occasionally, if the weather was decent, you might find Lily out there on a break between school and homework, bouncing a tennis ball against the sheet metal supplier's wall while Daniel was on a call inside. Just a kid in Hamilton, at the end of an ordinary dead-end service road, in the city where she was born and where her father had spent 9 years doing work that mattered before anyone noticed it did. Some companies don't survive long enough to understand who was holding them up. Hartwell Foods was luckier than most. They found out with enough time left to do something about it. Daniel Okafor, who had never once stopped doing his job well regardless of whether anyone was paying attention, just kept going, the way he always had, one honest repair at a time.